Good morning, everyone. I hope you can hear us all now. Um, we are going to be talking about backyard composting today, and we are the UC Master Gardeners of Napa County. We're doing this in partnership with the City of Napa and Napa County. The presenters are myself, Lonnie Payne, Sue Helms, Penny Paul, and Cindy Water. We are the UC Master Gardeners of Napa County, as I mentioned, and our mission is to extend research-based knowledge and information on home horticulture, pest management, and sustainable landscape practices to the residents of California, and be guided by our core values and strategic initiatives. We are non-paid volunteer educators. We undergo an intensive training program, which provides us a practical course in plant science and horticulture. We are certified to provide practical horticultural information to all Napa County residents. We stay up to date on current UC research gardening information. So let's talk a little bit about and define composting. Compost is a natural process of decomposition. It occurs in nature, but can be speeded up with human intervention. It breaks organic matter down to nutrients that plants can use. There are many benefits of compost. It reduces landfill. Approximately 30% of what we send to landfill is organic materials. Compost improves the soil structure in a variety of ways. It improves the water penetration in heavy soils. It improves water and nutrient retention. It improves the drainage and aeration in all soils. It nurtures and feeds soil organisms, which is going to be very important when we talk later about the actual process of decomposition. And it slowly releases nutrients and minerals that plants can use. And finally, it conserves soil moisture. I'll give you an example. A head of lettuce can take up to 25 years to decompose in a landfill. We can do much faster with that when we do compost. There are a variety of uses for compost. Compost is considered a soil conditioner. It improves the tilth. When we talk about tilth, we're talking about the physical condition of the soil. It makes it easier for plants to absorb nutrients and water. It's important to realize that compost is not a fertilizer. Compost feeds the soil, not the plant, where fertilizer feeds the plant, not the soil. You can also use it as a soil amendment. You can use it as mulch, and you can also add it to your potting mix. So we'll talk a little bit about the biology of composting. The activity of micro and macroorganisms create heat, which speeds up the decomposition process. And decomposers consist of micro and macroorganisms. As I mentioned earlier, they create heat, which helps speed up that process. But if it's too hot, it can kill the decomposers. Decomposition also tends to help with the balance of carbon and the nitrogen ratio. When we have complete decomposition, it results in a humus-like substance, which we then call compost. What does compost need? As you can see in this picture, this is one of our companies here in Napa that is working on producing and creating compost. Compost needs the decomposers, it needs water, it needs air. It also needs the right temperature. Temperature plays a very important role in composting. And finally, we need the food. What are you putting in there that's going to create the compost? So the decomposers can be broken up into two groups, the macroorganisms, and these are the worms, the sow bugs, etc. These organisms munch, they eat, they break down the food. Then you have the microorganisms. The microorganisms are bacteria, fungi, and actinomycetes. And we're going to talk about those later. So this is a very interesting picture here. It's very busy. But if you look at it, you see the macro and micro organisms. So if you look at the bottom of the pile, there are beetles, there's ants, there's centipedes. You go up a little bit, there's springtails, there are roundworms. You go up through this, you see there's snails, you see worms, and that bacteria and fungi that I talked about earlier, all playing a very important part. I like to say when we talk about the macro and microorganisms, think of a kitchen grater. Kitchen grater, the rough side that grates, those are your macroorganisms. And the fine side of that kitchen grater are the microorganisms. The macroorganisms, they chew and tear matter. Some people consider them pests, and they work in the compost pile while it is cool. And here you see a variety of the different types of macroorganisms, ants, centipedes, sow bugs, you know, the kind of things that some people go, ew, but they are very important for creating compost. They help make more of a surface area for the bacteria to do its work and for the microorganisms to do their work. Let's talk about those microorganisms. They're chemical decomposers. They're the most important of the decomposers. There are three types, the psychrophiles, the mesophiles, and the thermophiles, which we're going to talk a little bit later about. One of the things that it's important to see is that these microorganisms all thrive under certain temperatures and moisture levels. And they are nutritionally diverse. They will eat almost anything. And they can reproduce at a very rapid rate. For example, 1 gram of bacteria could, in the right circumstances, create 450 grams in about 3 hours. And if you did the math, that's almost 1 gram of bacteria in the right conditions could almost create a pound of bacteria. They use carbon for energy and nitrogen to build protein in their bodies. The oxidation of the organic matter heats up the compost pile. So let's talk about those three types of bacteria. We have the psychrophiles. They're the first ones to go to work. They thrive at a temperature of about 55 degrees Fahrenheit, and they give off a small amount of heat. The mesophiles produce CO2 and heat, and they thrive at about 70 degrees Fahrenheit to 90 degrees Fahrenheit. They do most of the work in cool and warm method compost piles. And then you get to the workhorses, the thermophiles. They thrive at 140 degrees to 200 Fahrenheit. They work fast. They can do their work in 3 to 5 days. And when they do their work, it changes that organic material to a uniform, deep brown color. So all of these, the macroorganisms and the microorganisms have done their work, and then the compost, or that humus that we talked about earlier, is stabilized. And it's stabilized by the fungi, and it could be the saprophytic fungi, which obtain energy from and help decompose the dead and decaying matter. It could be the actinomycetes, which are part bacteria and part fungi. They produce a grayish cobweb type substance. They're responsible for that earthy smell that you know you have compost. They free carbon and nitrogen for plant use. And now Cindy Helm will talk to us about the food.
I'm Sue Helms, and I get to talk about the ingredients that make up a compost pile. No technology, very simple things. Organic material. You're going to be looking for two kinds of material: browns, which are carbon-rich materials, and greens, which are nitrogen-rich materials. Let me talk about the carbon-rich materials. They're usually dry. Examples would be like dried garden debris, dried grass clippings, prunings, bark chips, dried leaves, paper and cardboard, straw. A great one if you don't have a lot of brown things is rice hulls. You can buy them at a feed store, and it's relatively, they're quite expensive. Okay, now I'm talking about the greens. The greens are not green, and sometimes the browns are not brown. Here's an example. Fresh green grass clippings are greens. Brown dry grass clippings are brown. So other examples of greens are green leaves, kitchen waste, vegetables and fruits, and we'll be talking more about how you do that. Here's an example of one green that is brown: coffee grounds. Tea bags or tea leaves, fresh garden debris, fresh or aged herbivore manure. In other words, from animals that don't eat meat. Next. Excellent. Here's an example of how you want to cut down your kitchen scraps. The picture on the left shows some lovely kitchen shears, which are great for doing this. The white things are tortillas, in case you're wondering. And the beige things are tortillas. And then the picture on the right shows them again. And then in the middle, it shows them after they're being chopped up. Very small size. This will make for quicker compost. The bigger the pieces are, the longer it's going to take to break down. Next. What not to add to your compost? There are quite a few things. You don't want to add any meat or fish products, dairy products, any fats or oils. And that includes, if you have a lovely salad that you make with a lovely oil and vinegar dressing, don't put that in your compost pile, because the oils will help attract critters, which you don't want. You don't want to add soil because you don't need it. You don't want to add wood ashes. You don't obviously want to add weed seeds, or I wouldn't add the roots of perennial weeds either. You don't want to add meat-eating animal manure either, so no pet manure. You need to check with your disposal company. In Napa, the yard waste can take a lot of these things. They don't want soil in it, but they'll allow you to put that in, but it's not true for many of the other, like St. Helena, American Canyon. So just check with your provider, because things are changing all the time on this. Next. Okay, methods of composting. Here's the 5 methods of composting that we're going to talk about today. The first one you're going to hear about in a minute from Penny Paul is worm composting, which is kind of a whole different thing, and she will explain that. And then I'll come back and talk about lasagna or sheet composting, cool composting, warm composting, which is the most popular one, or rapid. And those last 3 are obviously based on temperature. So now I'm going to turn it over to Penny Paul. Next.
Much to think about. Good morning. I'd like to tell you about the importance of worm composting and the reason that the county and city sponsor this. Worms eat 90% of everything you give them, and of that remaining worm poo-poo and other poo-poo, it becomes a wonderful balanced fertilizer based on what you have fed them. Only red worms are the worms that eat decomposing materials. And you can see a picture here of my worm bed with 2 worms. These worms are hermaphrodites, which means that everybody lays eggs. but they do have to exchange bodily fluids to do it. And you can see the egg right there. And out of that egg may come 1 to 3 babies in about 2 weeks. I want to point out to you that the worm on display, the Worm Composter Champion, they don't have mouths, they have chewing parts, and they don't have eyes. Their whole body is light sensitive. Next. Worm compost contains 5 times more nutrients than regular garden soil. And it is the only fertilizer that I use. I put it in every pot when I repot something, and I use it as a fertilizer on potted plants and in my garden. It helps garden and house plants by improving soil fertility. And it saves you money by replacing store-bought soil conditioners, and worms are nature's recyclers. And like us, they are immigrants, and we will explain that to you when you come to the worm composting workshop. You can buy worm compost, and the name of it is Worm Gold because it costs so much money. I became interested in this subject when I saw an article in Life magazine, which was on some things that were in the landfill in New York City. And when they dug up some things that were like 25 years old, they found a newspaper that was still readable, and they found a hot dog wrapped in a bun that looked like it was very fresh. And the reason for that is no microbes or oxygen gets to that area to help it decompose. In the workshop, we'll show you how to build a worm bin and explain which worms to use. And you will receive the bin, materials to build the bedding, and also worms to start the system. And the do's and don'ts of worm composting will be explained to you, and you will be able to ask questions. You can save landfills and make this wonderful castings right in your home. And be sure to sign up. It will be on June 12th. You'll sign up the same way you have for this compost workshop today. And worms rule, so be sure to come. Thank you. Locate your bin in any place, these listed. Mine are all in the garden because they're big bins, but you do have to make sure that they are in the shade. I lost one whole worm bed once when we had a heat wave and I was away, and the worms baked. This is a view of Lonnie's worm bin from last year. You can see the worms in it, and you can see the compost that is forming. You can see the newspapers and other things that have been put in there. I see a banana peel. And this is what the inside of your worm bin will look like. Next. This is worm compost that I've removed the worms from. However, it has not been sifted. And you can see the other materials that are in there. I see a peach pit, I see an eggshell, I see some stuff I don't recognize. And one of these days I will sift this, but I still have sifted, so I haven't done it yet. Next. This is the sifted compost. This is what I use to add to potted plants and use as a fertilizer on potted plants. And it is excellent. Next. I turn it over to Sue now.
And talk to you about some other kinds of composting. The first one I'm going to talk to you about is lasagna or sheet composting. And it's great if you want to get rid of a lot of weeds. You have to, I'll talk about what you have to do, but It's a great way to condition large areas of your yard if they haven't been planted with anything. It's a great way to get rid of old lawn that you no longer want. And I have even used it for a place where I've just had some persistent weeds. I've used this technique just to get rid of, like if I have some plants and then there's some bare soil and the weeds just keep coming up there. Well, you want to not have bare soil, but there's some places that sometimes you do. And so I've used this there too. So here's the process to do sheet composting. You want to wet the soil first, and each layer of materials you add, you wet it. So you just keep kind of spraying it all the time. I begin with putting some sort of cardboard. I've done it with newsprint, although you have to do about 4 to 5 layers of newsprint to make it thick enough. So you want to put that bottom layer down, and that's going to keep the sunlight from hitting any seeds, weed seeds, and letting them germinate. Then you're going to do alternating layers of browns and greens. And you're going to plant when the materials have decomposed, and that can take a while. Although I will say, it's also great for filling up beds. I have some old garden beds that had kind of shrunk down, just kind of disappears, gets blown away, whatever. So I wanted to refill the beds, and I didn't want to pay for materials. So I recently did sheet composting in those beds, and I started one bed in the beginning of March, and I just put burlap over the top of it. I did different layers of browns and greens, and it's almost ready now. Not quite, but it's pretty close. And I thought it would take like 5 months or so, but it's going to be done much more quickly than I thought. Next. Here's an example of a big job of a big lawn that is being covered with appliance cardboard and then marked off with rows. You can see the compost being put in, and then there was rice straw put in between for walking paths for garden beds. Next. Here's an example at the end of that process. And it's worked out really well. Even though the weeds still will try to come in, they're much easier. I don't walk on the dirt or the actual soil. So it's been very successful for a garden bed. Next. Here, I'm going to talk about different kinds of composting that relate to temperature. Cool or no fuss composting is how most of us get into composting, because you think it sounds great and you make a pile and then you kind of forget about it. And we say that's where the phrase compost happens. It will turn to compost. It's just going to take a really long time. You could keep adding compost to it as you get it. You don't really have to pay attention to it. It takes a really long time, 1 to 2 years. It does not kill seeds or pathogens in the soil. And it's your cooler temperature organisms at work. Next. Warm composting is a great hybrid, and it's probably the most popular. There's more control. You monitor it more. You may or may not add new organic matter. And this is kind of like making a soup. You might be making a soup and then add something later, and it will still work. The pile will get warm. You need to turn the pile occasionally. All the different things that Lonnie was talking about will come to play here. It can take 3 months to a year to complete, and it will not kill seeds or many pathogens. Next. Rapid or hot composting is much more like baking a cake. Imagine I'm doing a cooking show and I have little bowls of things all around me. And we did do a sheet composting workshop, which I believe is available as a video last week. And instead of little bowls, I had 5-gallon buckets that I used to make my sheet composting. So you have to gather your materials together. It's very controlled and needs to be monitored frequently. You're going to do equal volumes of brown and greens in layers to fill a bin. You're not going to add new organic matter. You're going to turn it every 3 to 5 days. So the pile, when you first layer it, it will heat up and then it'll start to cool down. And that'll take about 3 to 5 days. And then you turn it. It kills many pathogens and seeds. And here's what's amazing about it. You can have complete decomposition in 3 to 8 weeks. And just a couple of things I forgot to say in the technological excitement. When you're building your compost piles, don't add like rose clippings or anything with thorns in it because they will not break down. That was just a little aside I wanted to say. This is a terrific way of doing composting. It just takes more work. Next. This is another way of talking about what Lonnie was talking about, how the different organisms like to work at different temperatures. And this is showing the temperatures that will kill off some of these organisms. So the ones that work when the pile is cool, after about 145 degrees, they're going to stop operating. After 160 degrees, the warmer. Above 200 degrees, nothing is going to be cooking. So when you're making your pile, you just need to kind of look at it. You can tell how hot it is. You could also get a compost thermometer. I mean, you can tell roughly how hot it is, or if it's not doing anything at all. But compost thermometers are available and not expensive. So that might be something you want. And now I'm going to turn it over to Cindy Waters.
Thank you. Thank you, Sue. Okay, we'll talk now about building the pile. 3 foot by 3 foot by 3 foot is the ideal size. In other words, 27 cubic feet, which is the size of most commercially made compost bins. The particle size should be small, 1/2 inch to 1.5 inches. And it should be, for hot compost, you should layer the greens and browns in equal amounts, as Sue said, dampen like a wrung out sponge, and turn the pile every 3 days to introduce oxygen and raise the temperature. For cold or warm compost, the green-brown perfect balance is not as necessary. You still should turn the compost because it will compost faster. And you should bury fresh additions in the center of the pile. And the reason we do that is to not attract animals. And as for temperature, it is strange but true. 155 degree compost piles will decompose twice as quickly as 130 degrees. And if you're doing hot compost, of course, for the quantity you'll need, you'll collect your browns and your greens over a period of time and then put them in all at once. Next. Tools. Okay, well, let's remember one thing, keep them sharp. You won't need too many. You'll need a shovel, a pitchfork, and if you're doing large scale composting, a chipper, shredder, or lawnmower. A weed whacker and a garbage can chop up dried leaves very, very finely, or for smaller scale, use a blender or a food processor. Pruning or lopping shears for your yard waste, a good pair of scissors for your kitchen waste, and a sharpening tool are all necessities. Next, okay, yes, a thermometer to monitor temperature, as Sue said, a compost sifter to remove non-decomposed matter, because what happens is you'll sift out your compost, and what's left over you can either throw back in your compost pile to keep composting, or you can use it as mulch or something. This is a neat little sifter. You can order them, buy them anywhere. Gold miners use it to panning for gold. It will fit over a 5-gallon bucket. Mine is a homemade sifter, and you'll see it later on. You need a claw to turn the pile or bury kitchen waste. You'll need a wheelbarrow to move your compost around. And, you know, there are different types of bins. Next. is my bin with a little shovel on top. Now this one actually has 3 parts. You only see 2 because as your compost starts decomposing, the pile shrinks. And so this makes it easier for me to mess around in it. Next. I mean, as for bins, oh gosh, let's go backwards, Lonnie, please, to see the bin. I mean, we don't have to. It's fine. As for bin shapes, the one you see is just your basic square, but I've seen the Darth Vader bins. I've seen the Mayan temple bins. I've seen in someone's backyard, I'd never seen it before, a gigantic sphere that is filled with compost material, and you just roll it around the yard so you don't have to turn it. I've also seen the drum-like cylinder that's mounted on legs, and you turn it with a handle. This is popular with hot composters. I've seen just a tube of chicken wire, and I've seen just a pile. The one that you just saw is mine, and it's the 3 foot by 3 foot, but they all work. They all do work. Okay, now here's a picture of our tools. And this is going to be, my lead into my safety discussion. You can see the clippers of various sizes. There's a big lopper. I find the short-handled ones easier to use. We're going to go clockwise here. These are some titanium-coated scissors by a well-known scissor manufacturer, and it really cuts up kitchen waste, and chicken bones and things like that if you're going to put it in your big bin for the garbage company. And down here is another clipper. Down here is something for digging up weeds. Very handy. It's a Japanese weeding knife. And then over here is the good old Felco classic pruning scissors. And then right here in the middle is something you don't want to forget about. This is a sharpener, well-known brand, and not very expensive. And just every so often, swipe that over your tools and you'll be a lot happier. You'll be avoiding possible accidents. And keeping your tools sharp makes cutting just a lot easier. Okay, next. Great, garden safety. I'm going to say use common sense. Use common sense. You should wear gloves. You should, if you're out working in your garden, you should be wearing long pants and a long sleeve shirt. You should be wearing some sort of safety glasses. You should be wearing a mask over your nose and mouth, which we all have these days. And the most common methods of pathogen transmission are ingestion, meaning eating it, which I'm sure is an accident. Inhalation, actually not an accident. I was messing around with some dried leaves this morning and breathed in some leaf dust because I wasn't wearing a mask. Or skin trauma, otherwise known as you've had a really dumb kitchen accident, okay, and you've got some broken skin, which happens to me all the time. The people most in danger are the very young, the very old, and the immunocompromised. However, I am 70 years old and I have never seen anyone killed by a compost pile. What I've told you to do dealing with compost is really what you should be doing in the garden anyway. You should. And I am just going to repeat, use common sense. Next. Okay. Okay, this is some compost and a picture of a wheelbarrow and a sifter taken in my backyard. This is some old forgotten compost that had been covered with ivy. I mean, it was several years old, and it was cold compost. It hadn't been turned in years. It composted perfectly. And over here is my sifter, which I made out of a discarded window frame my husband found on the street and some 1/4-inch wire mesh. And then I went on YouTube and figured out how to use my staple gun and just, stapled it on. And you can see I've sifted it, and that's what's been left behind. Next. And here is a close-up of what's been left behind. You can see peach pits, which don't compost. Just remember, those are years old. Walnut shells, don't compost. They're years old. You can see a few roots that didn't compost, and you can also see the fiendishly non-compostable plastic labels that are on fruits that, and I always tell my family, do not, just please peel the plastic off and throw it away, and they never do, and it ends up in the compost pile, and it will live forever. Okay, next. And here is my beautiful finished compost, and you see I'm correctly holding it in a gloved hand, and it's very nicely moist. And if you look, you can see eggshells. Those are the brown eggshells, and there's some white eggshells. It looks great. Next. Bin location and rotation. Okay, the best system is the one that you will use. All bins, all shapes, they all work well. Okay, the location, it can go anywhere, but you probably don't want to have it way down at the back of your yard, you know, in the dark corner, especially if you empty your vegetable scraps at night and you have a lively imagination. I mean, you know, they don't smell bad. I mean, if they're maintained correctly, they don't smell bad, and you can really put it anywhere in your yard. And as for rotation, you should be realistic. You should know whether you're a type A, a type B, or a type C, or like me, the sort of person who forgets the compost piles in the corner and ivy grows over it. Maybe you're just not organized enough to do hot composting, which is the UC approved method. Don't feel bad. The other methods, warm compost and cold compost, work well too. And they just take longer. They work just as well, but they take longer. Next, troubleshooting. Okay, there are only 3 things that can go wrong. The pile doesn't compost, the pile smells, or you've got rodents. Okay, if it doesn't compost, it's too dry, it doesn't have oxygen, it has too much carbon. Spray it with water, turn it, add some greens, but it's probably really, it's too dry and you don't have enough oxygen. So spray it with water and turn it. Remember, you want the wrung out sponge texture. Feel a level of dampness. If it's wet and smelly, find if any of your family helpers inadvertently put in dog poop or a chicken carcass or maybe some old cheese. Empty it out, clean the forbidden materials out, spread the compost to dry, put it back in the bin. It'll be fine. If it smells, yeah, I guarantee you there's been some meat or grease added. And other animals, that's because they are attracted to food waste that isn't buried. Or perhaps it's not protected, it isn't covered. You might want to put a 1/4-inch mesh screen at the bottom of your compost bin, because the compost bins don't have bottoms. So you can lift them up and turn things. And there's a cute little raccoon. Yes, they're all over Napa. Next. Okay. Oh, we're going to go out and do a demonstration now. I almost forgot about that. I'm very excited. We're going to go to my backyard and I'm going to show you how to build a pile. Okay. Okay, here we are. Now I'm going to put on my hat. I've got my protective eye gear. I'm going to put on my COVID mask, and I'm going to get started. You see my tools here. Okay, let's put on my gloves because I've already got a Band-Aid on my right hand. I don't want to make anything worse. And I'll show you what I'm going to put in. First off, we've got some great product placement here. Okay, right here, this is our nice little under the counter bin, under sink bin that we get from our garbage company. This is really a hot item. And you can see I've got my greens here. This is coffee, my morning coffee. I think I'll tear up that paper, the paper filter, and let's just lift this out. This is all pretty fresh. This is actually from yesterday. We eat a lot of vegetables in the house. You can see some coleslaw. How's that? Does that look great or what? Is that attractive? I mean, if I were a raccoon, I'd be all over that. Okay, and here I've got some semi-rotted straw and dry leaves. So I'm just going to kind of layer it in here. That looks great. Throw the leaves in. And you'll see that I actually broke up the little sticks here. For you, I probably wouldn't have bothered myself, but you know, I wanted to look professional here. Okay, now this is what I did, annoying my family. This is really from just a few days, but I threw this in the freezer. And when you put it in the freezer, I can tell you that the dries and the greens are going to be about equal volume. But when it defrosts, it kind of collapses. It loses some of its volume. And there we are. How attractive. Okay, I see some orange peels in here. They were cut up in a blender. As a rule, we don't put citrus in because it alters the pH. It alters the pH, and it'll take a while to decompose, frankly, because it does have oil in it. A little bit, but a few peels aren't going to hurt us. Here's some more. Here's some more rice. I think I've got some rice hulls in here. Here's some more of this. More straw. Oh, look, I see a bird feather in there. Don't panic. It's organic. I'm going to put some rice hulls in. Here's what rice hulls look like. Okay, they're like $8 for 50 pounds at any feed store, which is more than you can use. I sort of share them out with people, but I kind of get a kick out of it because in compost, they kind of fluff, they kind of aerate the compost. They keep it from getting too soggy. And here's more. What do you see? Okay. I've got coffee, carrots, eggshells, whatever. A non-torn up coffee filter, which is a little annoying. Celery. Oh, look, a rubber band. Boy, I'm glad I saw that. These are really annoying. They really are. Oh, gosh. And I said we're making a soup, right? Okay. This is so incredibly messy. I'm making some soup. And, oh, good. There's some strawberries. We went through a real strawberry binge lately. I'm just going to get in here with my hands. If this were a giant compost pile, I would be using a shovel and not my hands, but it's okay because I've got my gloves on. Let's rip this up some more. Okay. I think I need something else here. We said that this was, there's the vegetables. We said that this was like a soup. Okay, my mask is sliding down, but it's okay. I'm vaccinated. But I don't want to breathe any of this in. Okay, good. It's starting to get mixed up. But now we have the pièce de résistance. Shall we say we have the umami to our soup? This is chicken manure, which I got for my tomatoes. But chicken manure is good in compost. It really attracts our decomposers. Okay, I am going to, oh, here, I just wanted to show off these scissors. They're great. I love them. And they're plated with titanium, so they're super sharp. And this is good too. I can use this. In fact, this might be helpful in getting everything up off the bottom. It is like tossing a salad, isn't it? Woo. Okay, I see it's starting to get mixed. The vegetables and fruit peels, they're wet, but it's not quite wet enough. So I've got some water here. I'll put that in. And as Sue said, I didn't put any roses in, not just because of the thorns, but because roses have viruses, and you should just get them out of the yard. There. Pull that apart. This works very well with a pitchfork, with your big, or they call them garden forks, but with your big compost pile, you would be using a pitchfork for this. But I think it's kind of, let's see, I've got some stuff down here at the bottom. Let's pull this up and put that on top.
While you're doing that, we had a question come in that says, why layer everything if you mix it up after?
Makes it easier to mix up afterwards. That's a great question. In fact, I was asking myself, why don't I keep mixing it as I go along, as I'm layering it? But that would take forever. You layer it because then it's like, think of it as pre-mixing. Otherwise, you'd have one thing at the bottom and one thing on top, and it's very hard and time consuming then. Uh-oh, look what I see. I see a rose leaf in here. A diseased rose leaf. It's not staying in my compost pile.
I saw an earlier question about it
It's
catching
this
on
attention to
fire.
detail that leads to compost success. This is a joke. Pretty much you throw anything in and it's going to decompose. But what I'm doing now is making it easier.
Kendra, what was the question that you said you had?
Oh, this is Yvonne. There was a question about it catching on fire.
Oh, yes.
I'm so glad you asked that question. Yes, this has happened. There was a lady, a friend of another composter, who threw a ton of alfalfa into her compost pile because it wasn't composting. Yay. This is what I want. This is pretty good. She put in so much alfalfa that she saw smoke coming off it, and it was getting ready to catch fire. And another time I did something along those lines and scorched. The compost pile was too close to was built right against the fence. Probably not a good idea. And scorched the fence. So these things can happen, but you have to be really, really uninhibited with the nitrogen. You don't. So, just you put a little bit in. Okay. How's that?
Cindy, I would add a comment that if you keep it moist as you're supposed to, the moisture is supposed to be equivalent to a wrung out sponge. So that moisture helps reduce the chance of catching fire. And if you turn it every couple of days, you're also going to be keeping it from catching fire as well, because you're mixing all those ingredients up really well.
Yes, that's true. She's right. It's the concentration. It's the concentration that, hey, this looks good. It's mixed up. See, look, it's mixed up. I'm putting my hand in. Yep, look at that. It's the right dampness. This is going to be great. I'm really thrilled. And this is going into my compost bin, which is a warm compost pile. And I'm going to bury it in the center. I'll bury it in the center. Ta-da. And except for the browns where I did a little bit of scavenging, but the greens are just from a few days. And in about a week, they're going to just pack down in the compost pile. It takes up surprisingly little room. My compost pile, I've noticed, seems to reduce to about 1/3 the original size when it's done. And what do we have next? Questions?
We have a question, why the mask, bacteria, and fungus? Question mark.
Why the mask?
Yes.
Well, I am not immunocompromised, but you can breathe in dust particularly from the browns, and I do have asthma, so that's why.
Let's see. I think we had a few more. What was wrong with the diseased rose leaf? Does it create disease compost that will pass to your other plants when you use it?
It might. Yeah, it has, it's got rust. I defy anyone to grow a rose that doesn't have rust, black spot on it. I mean, it's just something we deal with. It's the payoff for having a beautiful flower.
Let's see if we have anything else. So if anybody has any questions, you can go ahead and type them into the Q&A box or raise your hand and we can unmute you to answer the question. Let's see, we got more. Can you use succulents?
I should think so. They're just like a vegetable. I don't think it'd be any different from a cabbage.
Let's see what else we got.
Penny raised her hand. So
Oh, okay. Let's see if I can do that.
was there another?
This looks great.
We often get questions about putting diseased material into compost. This is Yvonne, and I'm a master gardener. I'm the coordinator, and we often recommend that you don't add anything that has diseases to your compost, especially if it's a root disease. Leaf diseases are not as big of a deal, but you still, if you want to be extra cautious, would put them in your green waste bin. That would go down to the compost facility. So anything diseased or with a lot of seeds in it, like your weed seeds that you don't want to add in there, you would put into your green waste bin rather than your home composting. Because we often don't get our home composting hot enough, unless you're really good at it, you're probably not going to kill the diseases. So we want to send those off to the professionals who do it really hot and kill all the bad guys.
Ta-da!
Okay, so we have, are you perpetually adding to your compost? How do you know when to take it out? Oh, go ahead.
Sorry, I was going to interrupt. And if we're done with the demonstration, I know Lonnie has a little bit more of the PowerPoint to share. And then I would want to invite all of our panelists so they can answer the questions together.
That sounds great.
Okay. I can answer this last question if you like.
Sure.
Well, I can tell by the way it looks. I mean, because I've been adding it all along. I mean, does it look remotely like a black compost that I forgot about? Then yes. And of course, it all won't be done at once, but I just sift it out, keep the compost that's completed. And with me, it's like 3 months, 4 months, keep the compost that's completed and then put the stuff that doesn't go through the sifter back in the pile and start over. But it is incredible how much I just can't conceive of not composting. Just look at those bags of vegetable peels that would otherwise go to waste. What a lot of satisfaction you get out of this. See? I'm thrilled.
All right.
Thank you, Cindy. Thank you, Cindy. So Lonnie has on the screen some resources.
Kendra, can you hear me?
I will let him speak about this. And then
Yes.
What's going to happen at the end is we're going to invite all of the panelists back up. So Sue, Penny, and everyone. And Yvonne is going to ask the questions and each one could take a shot at the answers that they feel comfortable answering.
All right. All right. So if everyone can hear me, on the screen, we have some resources that we used when we were developing this presentation. And they're very useful. They are easy to look at and they're easy to retrieve. So as you can see, we have English and Spanish for some. There's UC Davis, because once again, since we get our information is always based on science, we have resources such as the UC Davis link, the Master Gardener tip sheets. And as you can tell, we gathered information from a variety of locations. Here's a Sacramento Master Gardener group. We try to be very thorough when we do our research in preparing these presentations. So once again, and you will have access to these when you, there will be a link that you can see this slide presentation, and you'll be able to get that. Also, next we're going to talk about the upcoming composting events. On May 26th, there's going to be a Harvesting Your Compost pile. Today we talked about composting, and Cindy showed you how to set up a compost. Well, in 4 weeks from now, we're going to show you how to harvest that compost. And we're going to show you how to harvest not only the compost that Cindy showed, but also worm composting. And then on June 12th from 10 to 12, Penny Paul is going to be doing Soup to Nuts worm composting workshop, where she's going to go into much more detail than she did on the slides that we showed you earlier about worm composting. And so with that, I think that is the end. Once again, you can find the slideshow and other resources on our website, which is the UC Master Gardeners of Napa County website. And I also want to do a little plug there. We have a great website. There's places where you can ask additional information. And I strongly urge you to check it out, because you might find that there's links to other pieces of information you might be looking for. And let's see if we have one more slide here. Yes, any additional questions that we didn't answer for you?
Looks like we answered quite a few of them a few minutes ago, but let me just review for everybody. So there was some questions about adding disease material, and I think we kind of answered that, but if anybody wants to add anything, there was a question that I think Cindy already answered about wearing a mask. Why wear a mask when you're turning the pile? Did anybody want to add anything else about wearing a mask or protective materials while you're turning your pile? Any from our team?
It's just good practice. You don't, even if you're not breathing in moldy spores and weird things like that, you don't want to breathe in dirt or dust. It's just not good for you.
Yes.
And Yvonne, I would like to jump back to the putting disease plants in the compost. It sounds like a no-brainer, but such things as rust and a lot of the other diseases, if you put in the composter, if it doesn't get hot enough, it doesn't destroy the things that cause those diseases. And so when you use that compost, you're spreading those diseases. So that's the reason why we try to be sure that we don't put those disease plants and disease greens in there. We always say if we see those on our plants, we snip them and bag them. So if you are someone who has roses and you see those spots on them or you see rust, you snip them, bag them, throw them in the trash can, not the recycler.
I don't know. We could go either way. I think it kind of depends on what they are.
Really? Okay.
A lot of them are going to get broken down, but you're right, to be extra careful if you want to put them in the garbage. But the hot composting does such a great job that I would say that we really can send a lot of our disease material to the city waste composting, because they're doing such a hot compost and really doing a good job of killing off those bacteria and diseases that we don't want. There was a question in the list here about adding onion. She's talking about the outer part of the onions, I believe onion skins. And any concerns or problems with adding that to your compost bin?
No, that's fine. Onion skins are great.
And what about eggshells? I know sometimes people ask about eggshells because they don't seem to really break down. Is it useful to add those or not to your compost bin?
Yes, they add to the texture, and they do break down to tiny little pieces, and they help keep your dirt loose, so the little roots can spread around.
And I know that Penny, I don't know if Penny's on still. Penny, I know we use those a lot in worm composting, right? The eggshells are good for the worms, aren't they?
The worms love the eggshells, especially if they have a little albumin left in them. And it's good for your soil. It adds calcium to the soil. I want to make one remark. Cindy didn't wet her pile, and both piles, worm compost and regular compost, have to be wet in order to actually work.
I noticed
if there is a cold compost pile.
When Cindy was mixing
The
her,
water gets it going.
Cindy did have a lot of that green material from her kitchen, which I think was pretty moist. So it actually looked pretty moist. So, but you're right, Penny. Normally, when you're building a large pile, you need to add water as part of your stirring process. We want to add some water in there.
I did add some water to the straw, but when the greens were defrosted, not only did they decrease in volume dramatically, and they lost their structure, but they were pretty soggy.
Oh, okay. I've never used that method.
Sorry, who was that?
This is Lonnie. I was going to add one other thing too. For those of us who live in the unincorporated area, who and might not have hot compost, one thing that I don't put in my compost are citrus. I don't put orange peels or lemon peels because they tend to take longer to disintegrate. I don't know if my other colleagues have had similar problems with the orange peels, but I don't put them in mine.
I also don't put tomatoes or tomato stems in there. And things with seeds in a worm compost bin do germinate. They don't eat seeds.
Yes, if you put a potato peel in that has an eye attached to it, you can get potatoes growing. If you throw in pumpkin seeds and you have warm compost, you'll have pumpkins growing, you'll have zucchini growing, you'll have tomatoes growing. Citrus peel, as I said outside, can change. If you put a ton of citrus peel in, you're going to alter you could alter the pH. And citrus peel takes a long time to decompose, if it's because it's got oil in it. But if you chop it up really fine, a little bit won't kill you. But if you're one of those families that goes through buckets of fresh orange juice, don't put it on your warm compost. You can give it to, if you live in the city, you can put it in your yard waste bin, and they can compost it.
And you do have to experiment a little bit. I know I put some citrus rinds in my compost bin, and the rats loved them and came in and dragged them all over the yard. So it kind of depends on what's happening in your pile and what your conditions are. Like you said, Cindy, if you have a lot of citrus, it will take some time to break down, and it might not be a good idea to add a lot of it. But if it's just a lemon rind here and there, is not going to be a problem. There was a question here about warm compost. When we're doing hot or warm compost, when do you stop putting in new materials? And I know, I think Sue talked about that as a batch method. Was that Sue?
Wait, what was the question? Ask her to say the question again.
Could you state the question again? Was it warm compost?
Sue or Cindy, I don't know. Somebody's asking about warm compost, when you stop putting in new materials.
Well, warm composting, you can continue to add materials. But it's when you have hot composting, you only want to do it all at once.
So hot composting is the one where it's a batch method. You have a volume mixture of greens and browns. It's the same volume. You mix them all together, you add the water, and then you stop, and you don't add any more to that pile. You set things aside for a new pile and then do a one batch, and then you stir it every few days, and it will break down very fast. You can have complete compost within a month if you really do a hot pile and really stir it regularly. But you have to keep it moist, and you've got to keep stirring it, and you don't add. But the warm pile is one where you kind of add as you go and just keep turning it. And eventually the stuff in the bottom breaks down. As Cindy was saying, you kind of sift it out. But so they're kind of two different things. So depends on what you're trying to do with your pile. I don't see any other questions specifically. Oh, yes, there was. Michelle has a drum composter that that's one that you roll around or turn. And she wondered if it needs to be left in the sun or put in the shade. Will either of those be better for composting?
If it's out in the sun and it gets really hot, it's just going to be cooking in there. I kind of maybe a place where it gets a little sun and then shaded for part of the day.
For most compost bins, they heat up just from the mixture of ingredients, not from the heat from the sun. So you don't have to put them in the sun. Any other questions? I don't see any other questions. All right. Well, somebody did ask about our resource page. If we were going to email that out to everyone, we don't normally do that, but it is available on our website. If you go to our website under our events, find us, you'll find all of the resources and the recordings of programs that we've done.
Well, thank you everybody for your time today, and thanks for bearing with us with our technical difficulties earlier. But look out for that email from us with more information, and have a great day.
I also wanted to say that we will have a workshop on harvesting your compost. So once you finish and you have all that wonderful compost, how do you get it out of your bin to use in your garden? And that's coming up along with the worm composting in the near future. So check the date for those and sign up. We'll see you again.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you, everyone.